kicking off week 11 of my 100 collage papers with texture plates, starting with the most basic cardboard, corrugated cardboard. This piece made itself a texture plate while I was trying to detach it from the rest of the box. This piece I will shape more intentionally for collage paper 68. And speeding things up some more, I did use the end of a mechanical pencil to break through some of the cardboard. I have seen people spray it with water. If you are having trouble peeling off your top layer of cardboard, that's another idea to try. I like that I can just use this without any need of any type of drying, and it was peeling quite well when I could pierce it, so I didn't feel the need to spray water on it. I got to a point where I liked how it looked and decided to use a layer of Liquitex Basics Ivory Black for my texture layer. You don't want it to be too thick, but not as thin as for an image transfer. And you can do pulls with multiple texture layers, but this gives you the basics of how to use one. I lay the plate into the paint and pressed it down firmly, being careful not to let it slip, which is another problem when you have too much paint. Pulled it off and decided how I wanted to arrange it to fill up the rest of my plate. And this needs to dry completely before we apply the pull layer. I decided to start with one of my favorites, copper. I will often use it to just give a glow. I then added light pink, cadmium yellow, medium hue, and quinacridone magenta. As often happens when I add color to my plate, it's a little too much, but it will work. I'm pulling this with cardstock. It will take a little more drying time, the thicker the paint. My Speedball Baron, and rolling the extra paint off my brayer. And again, after everything was dry, here are the results. Another thing with the thicker paint is you can't really see how it looks on the plate as the top blends together. I got out my glue gun for a texture plate for collage paper number 69, again using the heavy corrugated cardboard. Started out with something basic, just lines. And I'm speeding things up because, as I said, it's just lines. As I could tell, the surface was not as level as I would like. I did turn it over to flatten it out against parchment paper, which works great for this. Did peel off some of the excess strings. Next, I started with concentric circles and really didn't like the way they were looking, so they morphed into something more rose-like. This was a little slower, so I did turn it over more frequently. You want to do it before things dry, but not when they're super wet. As this is smaller than any gel plate or silicone mat I own, I didn't want this to have straight edges, so I didn't end up filling the entire piece of cardboard. Happy with that one. I then moved on to use my glue gun to create masks for the next day's collage paper. These are also vaguely rose shaped, which isn't what I started out with this one. But I'm not very familiar with working with the glue gun to make shapes that I'm actually intending, so this works. As you can see, what you can create with hot glue for a texture plate or a mask is pretty much unlimited as long as you have enough pieces touching in your masks, so they hold together when you peel them off and while you use them. That being said, no matter how well you structure your hot glue mask, it will not last forever. They are not super sturdy, but that's okay. They are quick, easy, and inexpensive to make. And it's one more video in which I apologize for my hair. For my first hot glue texture plate pull, I am using Liquitex Basics Deep Violet and Quinacridone Magenta. Spread it out well, and while it is still wet, apply the plates. I didn't get the first one pressed down quite well enough. It didn't pull off as much paint as you can see the others did, so I did go back over that area I chose Phthalo Blue and Payne's Gray for the stripes. Same process. I do wish I had applied the paint to this one a little differently, probably used a little less so there would be more differentiation between my two colors. After all of the imprints have been made, this layer needs to dry completely before it's pulled with another color. In this case, cadmium yellow medium hue and brilliant yellow green added for the stripes. This will be another pull on regular cardstock. I do love my Speedball Red Baron. There is a link for it, as well as other materials used in this video in the description. The pull layer also needs to dry completely before you can pull it with the texture layer. I get questions about how long, and there's not an exact time because it will vary depending on how thick the paint is and on the weather. One way to tell if your paper is dry enough is to feel the back. It will feel cooler when it is still wet. These turned out interesting. I would like to work on creating things with heavier lines. As an experiment, along with Collage Paper 70, I decided to try putting some of my acrylic ink into my own spray bottle and see how it works. These peeled up great. As I mentioned, parchment paper is awesome for this. I recently purchased 2 glass cutting boards to use beneath my gel plates, and they are working great. So yes, they are also linked in the description. I am again using Deep Violet and Quinacridone Magenta to create my rosy mask monoprint. I have a piece of tissue paper about the size of this 5x7 gel plate. I did again get a little too much paint and probably should have taken a little off here, but went with it. Chose spots to lay my masks. Did have to peel off a little more of the excess strings, but as you can see, I did not pull off all of them. I have them placed how I would like, and here is where we can see that yes, I have too much paint, and yes, this tissue paper is too thin to be as effective as it could be. I had also been a bit concerned that the areas within my mask might be a little too fine to work well this way, but that's going relatively well, just really fussy and time consuming. Peeled off the tissue paper, and yes, you can tell I had too much paint. I decided to leave the excess paint on the plate instead of clearing out those areas around the flowers. I thought it would be interesting. While that dried, I got out paper for what became collage paper number 71 because I couldn't fit them into the same short with number 70. As you can see, my Liquitex Professional acrylic ink in bronze works just fine with my cheap little spray bottle from Amazon. Rolling off the excess Deep Violet and Quinacridone Magenta from my brayer, I noticed that my masks still had a significant amount of acrylic ink left on them, and neglecting to remember I had shut off my camera, I used them as stamps on my roll-off sheet. If I use the mask and ink idea again, I will use them on a painted background. And hopping back to collage paper number 70, here is the pull and the results. It's interesting, but yes, you can get a much neater look, but this is pretty interesting. I used modeling paste and a stencil for the texture plate for collage paper number 72. I didn't use my current favorite because I think it would be too fine. I got out a piece of scrap to put modeling paste on because when I started, I was afraid if I put it directly onto the stencil, I would make a mess. I decided to try the larger palette knife first after I got my stencil adjusted. One thing I do like about these 2 Tim Holtz stencils that I showed you is that, again, they don't have those hard line edges. They're more organic, And yes, I speeded things up, and no, I did not make a mess when I put the modeling paste directly onto the stencil and found out I had wildly underestimated the amount I would need. So this is a bit tedious, but still an easy process to create something that you can use over and over again. This one is large enough for my 8x10 gel plate. I had intended to fill in more of the texture plate than I ended up doing so, which does require letting sections dry while working on sections that keep your stencil from touching wet paste. I ended up leaving quite a few gaps in this because I liked the look at the time. After I made the print, I decided I would also like to have a texture plate that was more filled in. I decided to do something a little different for my color for this one. For the pull layer, I decided to use Liquitex Basics Titanium White. I applied the texture plate carefully and firmly, but not too hard. I did find out my cardboard was slightly bowed, maybe in the drying process, but all parts of it must contact the gel plate. I am using Liquitex Basics Bronze for the pull, not my favorite metallic, but the one that will show up the best through the white as it's the darkest. And you may remember hearing me say how if the paint is thin enough on your plate, the brayer will start pulling paint back off. With a too thin layer of quick drying metallic, it will also take off your underneath layer, quitting before I get further behind. Cardstock for the pull, and yes, you can see where my layers pulled off. Not my favorite, but a useful neutral. When I first heard about using Play-Doh on the gel plate, I was skeptical. But then I saw a video from CreatedandMadeStudios and understood the concept. Using Play-Doh allows you to use the texture of just about anything you can find in your monoprint without ruining the item, or if it doesn't really fit on a gel plate. Here I'm pressing Play-Doh against a large vase that I wouldn't want to get paint on, and I couldn't really roll it across my gel plate conveniently either. And here I'm pressing the texture of a plastic bottle against my Play-Doh by rolling it across. I went a little different than is typical for me for this Prince color palette with cadmium yellow light hue, bright aqua green, and cadmium red light hue, which to me looks more like an orange than a red. I started with my yellow, the color between the other two colors, if you will, and remembered to roll off some of the yellow before I started with the green, so I didn't completely destroy the green. Speeding things up. As I said, this is a totally different color palette for me, but I just found it cheerful, and I liked it with the purple too. Onto my red that is orange. I decided to do things a little differently with this pull, inspired by the fact that I had basically zero time. I do like the way that this roll-off sheet on an old book page is turning out, but I was really struggling with the brayer right then. Pressing my texture into the paint, which that's not different. We haven't reached the different part yet. Figuring out how I want to place things, and you wouldn't be able to tell that I had been to the hairdresser that day and she'd actually smoothed my hair. I'm not sure what I did to the front of my hair, but I wasn't really looking in a mirror while I was making art. So yeah, there we go. I really enjoy this using the Play-Doh for texture, and honestly, I'm surprised I haven't seen more of it. It's simple, it's inexpensive, it's clean, and it works so well and opens up so many opportunities for different textures. And here is where things are different. I'm not doing layers, I'm just doing a straight pull of the paint with the texture in it. So instead of seeing another color through it, you will see the white paper, in this instance, cardstock. There is definitely no waiting for the paint to dry, or you wouldn't get a pull, and you don't let the paper dry on the plate and paint either. And I think this looks really cool, and I love the colors. There is enough paint left on the plate for another pull. A ghost pull, it would be called. It will be not as textured in some areas, obviously, as you can see. I let it dry overnight because even I need sleep, and added a layer of light pink. Applied the cardstock to this, and yes, this again, we're back to the layers, so this has to dry. And here we have a very interesting ghost print. I could also have pulled it with one of the clear mediums, but I thought the pink would be fun. I was going to move on to cut foam on cardboard for a texture plate for collage paper number 74, but I thought Play-Doh deserved some more time and attention. I was showing at the beginning that this is the Play-Doh I was using in my previous Play-Doh video. I have a Mountain Dew bottle that I feel like I must say, yeah, no, I didn't drink it. Ugh. And an Adirondack basket. I didn't get my Play-Doh pressed down thin enough or apply it firmly enough to my basket the first time around. It would make sense to have something to roll the Play-Doh with. I tried the bottle, but it was not firm enough. And yeah, I haven't filmed any videos with myself on camera recently, and I didn't look at my hair and didn't have the camera situated low enough to be friendly for my apparently sticking out the front of my head hair. I did better getting the texture this time. In fact, I got a little more of it than I intended. But my plan was to cut this out in a circle to show more about what you can do with Play-Doh on the gel plate. I set aside my circle that I made with a jar that you may have seen me use to make paint circles earlier this year. Flattened out the excess instead of starting the other piece, and tried to figure out the best way to get the sort of lightning bolt pattern from the bottle onto my Play-Doh so I could put it into my print. Rolling it was not ideal. As I mentioned earlier, the bottle is not thick and sturdy enough. It squishes too much. So trying again, I trimmed the Play-Doh down to closer to the width of the lightning and pressed it down firmly. I did have one spot where I pushed it a little too firmly, so had to repair that. And this worked much better. Wasn't 100% sure how it would work in the paint, but onward. I did trim it down to a more manageable width for what I had in mind. I brought back the cadmium red light hue for my texture layer and rolled off some excess to keep my cadmium yellow light hue more yellow. Given how I wanted the red that's actually orange to look at the end, I should have gone with my instinct to remove some of the excess, but ran with it. I don't know why I have so much trouble with this brayer on the paper. I placed my circle with the texture from my little Adirondack basket where I wanted it on the plate, then used my strip from the Mountain Dew bottle to create sort of rows of vaguely lightning shaped lines, speeding things up as I worked my way down the plate and filled in my entire plate with texture. Peeled off my circle and left everything to dry. I decided to start this pull with Liquitex Basics Gold in the area of my circle, which is harder to tell it's a circle because of the way the texture was on the circle. And I'm using Liquitex Gloss Medium for the rest of the pull. And yes, you may have noticed in previous videos as well as just now, Condiment bottles are ideal to put this type of mediums in when you use them like this. I also use them in collaging as my adhesive, and as I get them in the larger jars, cheap condiment bottles from the dollar store or somewhere else are ideal. Another pull on cardstock, and as a layered pull, it does need to dry. And here is another bun paper. I think it would have been more effective if I had been more careful with how Farm Right Orange spread, but this is interesting. The pull wasn't completely clean, and I did lose a bit of paint on the gel plate, but Play-Doh is definitely a winner for texture in monoprints. I hope you have enjoyed this week's My 100 Collage Papers and feel inspired to make your own art. Give me a thumbs up if you are feeling inspired, and be sure to subscribe. I'll be back next week with another collage paper wrap-up, as well as every day with each day's papers short. And every Sunday I share a small art prompt to encourage you to reclaim your creativity and take time for creative self-care. Because we are better with art.